Welcome back to What Everybody is Saying, an ex-FBI agent's guide to speed reading people by Joe Navarro. We are on chapter 2, and we left off at our limbic responses, the three F's of nonverbals. The first part of this chapter dealt with the triune, is what he called it. I called it the trinary, but essentially it's the three different brain developments of the human brain. There's the portion of the brain just above the stem. There's the majority body of the brain. And then there is the frontal portion, the newer portion. And those are in order considered the reptile brain, the mammal brain, and the human, the thinker. Think of that statue, I can't remember who made the statue, but the statue of the thinker. There's a reason it has stood the test of time, because we all wonder what he's thinking. One of the classic ways the limbic brain has assured our survival as a species and produced a reliable number of nonverbal tells in the process is by regulating our behavior when confronting danger, whether it be a prehistoric man facing a Stone Age beast, or a modern day employee facing a stone hearted boss. Over the millennia, we have retained the competent, life saving visceral reactions of our animal heritage. In order to ensure our survival, the brain's very elegant response to distress or threats has taken three forms. And I've mentioned this repeatedly in this chapter and other videos: freeze, flight, fight. Though, if you want to tease somebody, you could say it's freeze, flight, and fright, because you're fleeing in fright, but in reality, it's freeze, flight, fight. And think about that for a moment. Deer in the headlight look. What is that? That's a freeze action. Trying to capture a cat or walking too close to a rabbit. That's the flight as it jets away from you rapidly. And then there's the you were looking at my woman. Yeah, what of it? Nobody looks at my woman. Well, I guess she's not your woman. The fight. Like other animal species whose limbic brains protected them in this manner, humans possessing these limbic reactions survived to propagate, which is not happening much anymore, because these behaviors were already hardwired into our nervous system. I am sure that many of you are familiar with the phrase fight or flight response, which is common terminology used to describe the way in which we respond to threatening or dangerous situations. Unfortunately, this phrase is only two-thirds accurate and half-assed backwards. In reality, the way animals, including humans, react to danger occurs in the following order: freeze, flight, fight. Remember, in insert number 7, the Millennial Bomber, the customs agent described that when she called him out, that Officer Diana Dean, when she called out Ahmad Rissam, he panicked and he fled. He fled, leaving investigators, I don't know, probable cause to inspect his vehicle to discover the incriminating evidence. And this led to a good result. Don't get me wrong. I mean, trust me, we were getting hourly briefings at points about these things. Um, We had to incorporate it into our daily activity reports. We had to have our daily pre-ship briefings incorporating the previous and the most updated security briefings. Any of you that were involved in any kind of government or government related contract work, you were getting them too, most likely. Um, though the benefit was all, I mean, we got all the ammunition we could ever want for going to the range on our own time, but they amped up our carrying capacity of what we were armed with. Prior to that, we were just you know nine, a little pew pew 9 millimeters. Bounce. Oh look, I bounced it off the windshield. Yeah. You know, from having just we'd always had 51 rounds available to us, and the escalation was having to be proficient with AR-15s and shotguns and other weapons and tactics and such. So they began to take it a little more seriously after that, which was great. That's what was needed. Anytime security is involved, no matter whether it's store security, bank security, all the way up to federal protection detail, security is often looked at as an expense. It doesn't produce anything. Well, that's because security is not supposed to produce something. That what it's supposed to produce is a deterrence. And it's hard to measure a deterrence. How do you measure a deterrence? Well, I built a dam and I can measure the volume of water that has been deterred from flowing. Yeah, because it's natural. You do not know, you can't know the minds of men, you know, and that's a scary series to watch from Truth Stream Media. Anyway, you can't know the minds of men and their intentions, as evidenced by the inserts, both with the cash register and with the customs officer. It's only because of recognizing something. One of these things is not like the other, but it's human nature to make assumptions. That's why you had a big push of saying it's bad to profile. And that's what I'm trying to counter here is that profiling isn't bad. It's because of the lack of training that's gone into it that causes people to profile incorrectly, such as Angela Biramova, who is going to jail for the next year and a half. And I hope she never gets out. All right, so where are we at? Propagate because these behaviors were already hardwired into our nervous system. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the fight or flight response, which is common terminology used to describe the way in which we respond to threatening or dangerous situations. Unfortunately, the phrase is only two-thirds accurate and half-assed backwards. In reality, the way animals, including humans, react to danger occurs in the following order: freeze, freeze tag in grade school, elementary school; flight, as you run from being tagged out or run from first to second, hoping that they don't tag you; fight, sliding into home. Anyway, I'm having fun, but one of the ways to increase one's memory of this is to assign things that create an emotional image in particular, whether it's comical, absurd. In addition to autodidactic, the method of loci is by creating visual cues. So by throwing in these little anecdotals and random things, I'm attempting to color these things in a way that helps you remember them and pauses long enough for you to write, freeze, flight, fight down and develop your own associations, or to use whatever I've suggested if you find it's appropriate. If the reaction really were fight or flight, most of us would be bruised, battered, and exhausted much of the time. This is a true statement. Most of us don't want to fight. How many of you have hit something? How many of you have been hit? And I don't care if it is a vehicle, an object. Little League Baseball is notorious for players being hit because of a pitcher, um, their arm getting worn out through over the course of several innings. Um, we've all been hit with a baseball, that played Little League. Uh, the same thing with football. We've all been hit, driving into each other, or if we were the receiver, getting tackled. Uh, let's see, what else is there? There's actual fighting, slap something with your hand open. You're going to have that stinging sensation for a period of time, both on yourself and possibly the object that you're hitting, if it's got a nervous system. The point being is, there's a reason that we don't fight that much, that only certain people fight. And that is because they're, as Sun Tzu calls it, on death ground, or there's something wrong with them in the head that they feel that they have nothing to lose, which is also an emotional response to Sun Tzu's death ground. So, in order to fight, most people are going to be in a panicked situation that there is no choice but to fight. That's why you're not seeing anybody, that's why the fight nowadays, as Andrew Wilson describes it and Alex Jones describes it, it's an information war. It's a debate war. We have our fights via intellect by mocking and calling out somebody's false information. That's why you had the Matt Taibbi expose and Michael Schellenberger expose of the Twitter files a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. That's why the federal government showed up the day Matt Taibbi was scheduled to testify before Congress. That's why the federal government sent agents to his door, was to intimidate him from testifying. There was no need to conduct violence. And we've seen this recently in our own lifetime. The reason that violence happens is because somebody becomes panicked and they get somebody to be a useful idiot, as Lenin of the Soviet Union would describe them, a useful idiot to climb up on a roof and take a pot shot at a leading candidate, or to get a court in Romania to declare an election wrong because the people didn't elect the right person, or locking up the leading French candidate because, well, we're scared. Those are the fight responses. Those are the responses of a panicked individual, a panicked party. You may disagree with my what I'm implying politically, but that is on you. And I'm not saying that my political ideology is correct. That's not it. What I'm saying is this information is going to help you be able to peel back the layers of social engineering in real time and have you be aware that when you are microphone in hand and questioning why people are protesting Tesla and making accusations that the interviewer is a National Socialist, and her response to them, if they were willing to answer any questions, and that's the other part. They're robotic. They're so overwhelmed by emotion, all they can do is protest or be violent. That when confronted with a question, they can't answer it, and their only resort is to respond to the German National Socialist Party of nearly a century ago. And her response is, "I'm Jewish." They have no capability of rational thought. This is a We live in the greatest time in history, everyone. Right now is the best time in history to observe social engineering in real time. I mean, I love the fact that the dozen or so of you people that are listening to this are listening to this and taking notes on it. That is fantastic. If you're getting this information from somewhere else, great, because I am not the official. Obviously, I am just I'm a student, just as you are. Look around. Look around at what's going on. You have in Oregon, for example, voters voting down these ballot measures. And if you're not familiar with Oregon politics, Oregon established what's called a ballot measure program. And most states have copied something similar, whether it's an initiative program or a ballot measure program. The concept is by gathering enough signatures as you would a candidate to get them on the ballot, you propose a ballot measure to bypass the legislative body. Because the legislative body, even though composed of your direct elected and your Senate you know, um, officials, is not legislating the will of the people. The ballot measure is direct democracy, and direct democracy said we in Oregon don't want ranked choice voting. The Oregon legislature in Salem has said, "F you, you're too stupid to know what's good. We 30 so people in Salem have decreed we will vote on it and tell you what to do." The millions of people of the state who said no. It's the height of arrogance, absolute height of arrogance. But that's what they're doing. They're panicked. They know that the clock is ticking on their death grip. And as Carrie Fisher said in the original Star Wars, the more you tighten your grip, the more systems will slip through your hand. And that analogy is based upon trying to squeeze your hand shut, holding grains of sand. No matter where in history an empire has done its best to be authoritarian and tyrannical in its death grip on power, it has failed every single time. If the reaction were really fight or flight, most of us would be bruised, battered, and exhausted much of the time. Because we have we because we have retained and honed this exquisitely successful process for dealing with stress and danger, and because the resulting reactions generate nonverbal behaviors that help us understand a person's thoughts, feelings, and intentions, it is well worth our time to examine each response in greater detail. The freeze response. A million years ago, as early hominids traversed the African savanna, they were faced with many predators that could outrun and overpower them. For early man to succeed, the limbic brain, which had evolved from our animal forebears, developed strategies to compensate for the power advantage our predators had over us. Anybody who's seen the beginning of the classic 2001 A Space Odyssey can visualize this. You have a tribe of early humans, hominids, whatever you want to call them, gathered around, living in caves, living in survival mode near a fresh water source, and there is a big predatory cat, and all is what it is. It's fighting for survival, and then one day that big black monolith appears, and around this fresh water supply, around this area, are the remains of other animals and other humans from the predatory cat, and whatever else had ended whatever creatures. One of the hominid humans picks up what looks like to be a femur and realizes this could be leveraged into a weapon. And if I recall correctly, the rest of the scene goes on. There's the pivotal tossing of the femur into the air, and it uh, transforms from a rotating femur into a rotating orbital space station. But prior to that, if it's not stated, if it's not shown, it's implied that those humans went to war with the other tribe of humans to secure their resources too, and ended the predatory cat. That's what's being described here. For early man to succeed, the limbic brain, which had evolved from our animal forebears, developed strategies to compensate for the power advantage our predators had over us. That's what's being described. And Kubrick was able to transform that emotion, that primitive survival emotion, into cinema. That strategy, or first defense of the limbic system, was to use the freeze response in the presence of a predator or other danger. All right, I might be jumping the gun a little bit with the 2001 analogy. All right, so I've described the driving blindness. The path you take that you travel all the time, whether it's walking down a hallway of cubicles in offices at work, or the route you drive or ride on your way from home to work, everything looks the same until it doesn't. And then it causes you to pause and wonder, wait a minute, what was there prior to the construction? Was it just trees? Was it just vacant? Did they take down a building that already existed? What color was that house prior to it being painted? And I included it in one of the videos on chapter one, the observational exercise, which I hope all of you, uh, you know, have benefited. That is the freeze response, and that is people become, things become invisible. They blend in. Now, we are rational enough to know that if you're walking around out there, you're going to be seen. But there's a concept called the gray man. The gray man is somebody who knows how to mask their presence in society, how to go about being seen but not observed. They walk in a manner that doesn't stand out, that blends in. They dress in colors that blend in. They minimize their body actions, their facial cues, their verbal exchanges, so there aren't any identifying aspects about their character. So when people are being asked later, when did the girl in the black shirt exit the stage? What are you talking about? I didn't see a girl in a black shirt exit the stage. There was always five. The classic Star Trek episode where Patrick Stewart screams, "There's only four lights." You know, it's that kind of thing. It's We don't need a torturer to convince us that there's five lights. We do it to ourselves. We have a there, there, we're 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 blind. We have a we If you look at the physiological structure of the eye, there is a legitimate blind spot in the way the eye is set up, and that is located on the back of the eye where the optic nerve connects to the eyeball. Anyway, I'm not trying to overwhelm you with information. This is all stuff that you can cross-reference, and I would encourage you to do so and let me know if I've gotten something wrong. So the freeze response in the presence of a predator or other danger. Movement attracts attention. By immediately holding still upon sensing a threat, the limbic brain caused us to react in the most effective manner possible to ensure our survival. Most animals, certainly most predators, react to and are attracted by movement. The classic Val Kilmer movie, Top Secret, even mocks this as they're approaching Flugendorf prison. And Val Kilmer and Chocolate Mousse and um, what was it, Latrine? I think it was Latrine. Are walking behind a tree, and Val steps, and the, the leaves crack, and they all freeze. And then he gestures to be silent with his forefinger over his mouth, and then all the steps are silent. Because sound draws attention, movement draws attention. This ability to freeze in the face of danger makes sense. Many carnivores go after moving targets and exercise the chase, trip, and bite mechanism exhibited by large felines, the primary predators of our ancestors. Haha, 2001 reference. Many animals not only freeze their motion when confronted by predators, but some even play dead. The possum, play possum, or hey, if a bear ever chases you, just play dead. I don't know how that would work. Which is the ultimate freeze reaction. This is a strategy that opossums use, but they are not the only animals to do so. In fact, accounts of the school shootings at Columbine and Virginia Tech demonstrate that students used the freeze response to deal with deadly predators. By holding still and playing dead, many students survived even though they were only a few feet away from the killer. Instinctively, the students adopted ancient behaviors that work very effectively. Freezing your movement can often make you nearly invisible to others, a phenomenon every soldier and SWAT team operator learns. Again, pop media reference. There was an Owen Wilson movie where, in one of his more serious roles, he played an American fighter pilot who was shot down over Yugoslavia, um, or somehow came down, and he's evading capture. And the satellite imagery, the American satellite imagery that NATO was using to try to locate him, um, it's been a long time since I've seen it. And if anything, it demonstrated the absolute futility and unviability of NATO. But there was a scene where Owen Wilson is running and they can see his heat signature. And then he drops and he doesn't move. And they can't understand, the observers, the technicians, the analysts can't understand for what reason he's not moving. Because he's not dead, because he's still radiating enough heat energy to be seen. Because when you die, you start radiating less. And When it turns back to his character, he had come across a mass grave that hadn't been buried, and he kept himself turned face downwards, not moving, as his pursuers couldn't distinguish him from the victims who had been murdered already. He blended in. He found a camouflage and he blended in. Thus, the freeze response has been passed from primitive man to modern man and remains with us today. As our first line of defense against a perceived threat or danger, in fact, you can still see this ancient limbic reaction to large felines in the theaters of Las Vegas where big cats are part of the show. As the tiger or lion walks onto the stage, you can be sure that the people in the first row will not be making any unnecessary arm or hand gestures. They will be frozen in their seats. These people were not issued memos to remain still. They did so because the limbic brain has prepared the human species to behave that way in the face of danger for over 5 million years. In our modern society, the freeze response is employed more subtly in everyday life. You can observe it when people are caught bluffing or stealing, or sometimes when they are lying. When people feel threatened or exposed, they react just like our ancestors did a million years earlier. They freeze. Not only have we, as humans, learned to freeze in the face of observed or perceived danger, but others around us have learned to copy our behavior and freeze their behavior also. Even without seeing the threat, this mimicry or isopraxism, same movement, evolved because it was critical to communal survival as well as social harmony within the human species. This freezing action is sometimes termed the deer in the headlights effect. When suddenly caught in a potentially dangerous circumstance, we immediately freeze before taking action. In our day to day life, this freeze response manifests innocently, such as when a person walking down the street stops suddenly, perhaps hitting himself on the forehead with the palm of his hand before turning around and heading back to his apartment to turn off the stove. Yes, you should have had a V8, huh? The old classic commercial, people slapping their palm against their forehead. That momentary stop is enough for the brain to do some quick assessing, whether the threat comes in the form of a predator or of a thought remembered. Either way, the psyche must deal with a potentially dangerous situation. Navarro, 2007, pages 141 through 163. We not only freeze when confronted by physical and visual threats, but, as in the example of the late night doorbell, threats from things we hear, oral, as in auditory threats. Yeah, already talked about that. Can also alert the limbic system. For instance, when being chastised, most people hold very still. The same behavior is observed when an individual is being questioned about matters that he or she perceives could get them into trouble. The person will freeze in his chair as if an ejector seat. Gregory, 1999. A similar manifestation of the limbic freeze occurs during interviews when people hold their breath or their breathing becomes very shallow. Again, this is a very ancient response to a threat. It is not noticed by the interviewee, and yet it is quite observable to anyone watching for it. If I'm not mistaken, I discussed this with emergency responders earlier in chapter 1 that when you're taking vital statistics, you don't let your subject know that you are counting their breath rate. Because the moment they become aware of it, just as when somebody turns on a camera, their behavior changes. I have often had to tell an interviewee to relax and take a deep breath during the middle of an interview or deposition, as he was unaware of just how shallow his breathing had become. Consistent with the need to freeze when confronted by a threat, people being questioned about a crime will often fix their feet in a position of security, interlocked behind the chair legs. That goes back to the behavioral table of elements, and hold that position for the ankle lock, um, and hold that position for an inordinate period of time. When I see this type of behavior, it tells me something is wrong. Also, it ties into footwork, having good foundation of, being stable. When you're certain of what it is you're speaking, you're going to have sure footing. It sounds silly because words aren't needing to have your feet planted. But if you observe people, you're going to find that the individual will reform their stance, widen their stance just a little bit, or replace their feet to make certain that their feet are in alignment, shoulder width apart, and sometimes they will lean back and slightly and cross their arms as they are having an exchange with somebody. And that is, you know, roughly, it doesn't always mean it, but that is somebody who is standing their ground and does not want to yield what it is that they're either hearing or what they're advocating. When I see hold that position for an inordinate period of time. When I see this type of behavior, it tells me something is wrong. This is a limbic response that needs to be further explored. The person may or may not be lying since deceit cannot be directly discerned, but I can be assured from their nonverbal behavior that something is stressing them. Therefore, I will pursue the source of their discomfort through my questioning or interaction. Now, recognize everything he's describing is the opposite of having a firm uh, stance. Interlocking, stand and cross your leg over the other at the ankle. It's a balance exercise, is it not? You could be easily knocked over if an outside source were to do something to you. So when somebody's doing that, they're not certain of what it is that's happening. Unsure, as it would say on the behavioral table of elements on the prevalence symbol, the U for unsure. Another way the limbic brain uses a modification of the freeze response is to attempt to protect us by diminishing our exposure. During surveillance of shoplifters, one of the things that stands out is how often thieves will try to hide their physical presence by restricting their motions or hunching over as if trying to be invisible. Ironically, this makes them stand out even further, since it is such a deviation from normal shopping behavior. Most people walk around a store with their arms quite active and their posture upright rather than stooped. Psychologically, the shoplifters or your son and daughter, as they try to surreptitiously swipe a cookie from the pantry, are trying to master their environment by attempting to hide in the open. And this ties into the gray man. People that follow the gray man technique become proficient in this masking. Another way people try to hide in the open is by limiting their head exposure. This is done by raising the shoulders and lowering the head, the turtle effect. Picture a losing football team walking off the field after the game, and you get the idea. Interestingly and sadly, abused children often manifest these freezing limbic behaviors. In the presence of an abusive parent or adult, their arms will go dormant at their sides and they will avoid eye contact as though that helps them not to be seen. In a way, they are hiding in the open, which is a tool of survival for these helpless kids. All right, we have an insert, box number 8. The night the hands stopped moving. I was at my mother's house a few weeks ago watching television and eating ice cream with members of the family. It was late at night and someone rang the doorbell, something that is very unusual in our neighborhood. Suddenly, in the midst of eating, everyone's hands froze, adults and children alike, as if choreographed. It was amazing to see how we all reacted with hands flash frozen at precisely the same moment. It turned out that the visitor was my sister who had forgotten her keys, but of course, we didn't know it was her ringing the bell. It was a beautiful example of the hardwired communal response to perceived danger and of the first limbic reaction, which is to freeze. Soldiers in combat react the same way. When the point man freezes, as exampled with the Top Secret Val Kilmer movie, that I provided, everyone freezes. No, nothing needs to be said. And here's the insert figure 4. The turtle effect, shoulders rise toward the ears, is often seen when people are humbled or suddenly lose confidence. As he described previously, the football team walking defeated, dejectedly off the field. You can find that in sports competitions. You can look at, for example, not even sports competitions. You can see it in politics even. The In 1992, people often call to it that moment when George Bush looked at his wristwatch during a debate as a tell that he'd already given up any chance of being reelected to a second term, and that it was a signal that Clinton was most likely going to win. You can see this in sports. You can see this in news interviews. There's a scene in that Light of Me where Tim Roth's character Lightman is watching the news, and the the person is describing their business, and he turns to his secretary and directs them to call his broker to sell all of the stock because they he recognized the incongruence of the body language versus the words being said. And this is something that I've seen as I've demonstrated, as I've said. I used to play. I used to pay my house payment, my mortgage, you know, by playing poker. I had a great deal for my house payment. I paid less than $400 a month for the taxes, insurance, and mortgage payment. But that part aside, I was able to make that playing poker with a no buy-in, and it's because of recognizing these signals. When somebody's got a good hand, they may use the turtle effect to hide the good hand, but you've got to be able to understand how the limbic system works to know how it manifests. And if it doesn't manifest with congruence, then it's deception, misdirection. All right. So that was figure 4. And the next one will be the flight response.